Request processing lifecycle. When a request is sent to a JSF-enabled application, the request can potentially encompass all 6 phases of the JSF lifecycle in Jakarta server pages. Here we are considering request processing lifecycle in Java server phases. With when request is sent to a JSF-enabled application, the request potentially encompassed all the 6 phases of JSF lifecycle. Regardless of whether you are using JSF with JSP pages, servlets, or some other web technologies, each request response flow that invokes the JSF follows a certain life cycle. Several kinds of request response life cycles can occur in the JSF-enabled application. You can have a request that comes from a previously rendered JSF page. If a JSF request, the request that comes from non-JSF page or non-JSF request. Likewise, you can have a JSF response or a non-JSF response. We are concerned with these three request response pairs. Non-JSF request generate JSF response. JSF request generates JSF response, and JSF request generates non-JSF response. Of course, you can also have non-JSF request that generate non-JSF response, because this does not involve JSF in any way, and JSF file lifecycle does not apply. Recall that the JSF phases have relatively simple lifecycle. A JSF page source is compiled into a JSF implementation class when a JSF server received a request. Then request is passed to the container, which passes request to the page class. The page class provides the request and then writes response back to the client. When the other pages are included, the request is forwarded, or when the exception occurs, the process includes a few more component or pages, but basically a small set of classes processes the request and send back to the response. When using JSF, the lifecycle is more complicated. This is because the core of the JSF is the music pattern, which has several implications. Use actions in the JSF generated views take part in facing the client that does not have a permanent connection to the server. The delivery of use actions or the page event is delayed until new connection is established. JSF lifecycle must handle this delay between event and event processing. Also, the JSF lifecycle must ensure that the view is correct before entering the view. To ensure that the business state is never invalid, the JSF system includes the phase for validation input and another for updating model only after input pass validation. In MVC, the presentation of data view is separate from the representation in the system, the model. When model is updated, the controller sends the message to the view telling the view update its presentation. When the user takes some action with the presentation, the controller sends the message to the model telling the model to the update its data. In JSF, the model is compiled on business objects that are usually implemented in Java beans. The control is the JSF implementation, and the UI component are the view. The JSF lifecycle has 6 phases as defined by JSF specification. Restore view. The restore view. In this phase, the JSF implementation resources. In this space, the JSF implementation restores the objects and data structure that represent the view of the request. Of course, this is the client's first visit to the page, and The JSF implementation must create the view. When the JSF implementation creates and the renders JSF-enabled page, it creates the UI object for each view component. The components are stored in a component tree, and the state of the UI view is saved for subsequent request. If this is a subsequent request, the previously saved UI view is retrieved for the processing of the current request. Next page is apply request values. Any data that was sent as part of the request is passed to the appropriate UI object that composes the view. Those objects update their state with the data values. The data can come from the input fields in a web form, from the cookies sent as part of the request, or from the request headers. Data for some components, such as component that create HTML input fields, is validated at this time. Note that this does not yet update the business object that composes the model. It updates only the UI components with the new data. Process validations. The data that was submitted with the form is validated if it was not validated in the previous phase. As with the previous phase, this does not yet update the business object in that application. This is because if the JSF implementation began to update the business object as data was validated and the piece of data failed validation, the model would be partially updated and in an invalid state. Update model values. After all validations are complete, the model of the business objects that make up the applications are updated with the validated data from the request. In addition, if any of the data needs to be converted to a different format to update the model, for example, converting string to a data object, the conversion occurs in this phase. Conversion is needed when the data type of the property is not a string or a Java primitive. Invoke applications. During this phase, the action method of any command button or link that was activated is called. In addition, any events that were generated during previous phases and that have not yet been handled are passed to the web application so that it can complete any other processing of the request that is required. Render response. The response UI component is rendered and the response is sent to the client. The state of UI component is saved so that the component tree can be restored when client send another request. For a JSF-enabled application, the thread of execution for the request response cycle can flow through each phase in the order listed here as shown in this figure. However, depending on the request and what happened during the processing and response, not every request will follow through these 6 phases. Here you can see when a request is sent to JSF-enabled application, the request can potentially encompass 6 phases of the JSF lifecycle. In this figure, you can see a number of optional paths through the lifecycle. For example, if error occurs during any of the phases, the flow execution transferred immediately to the render response phase. Skipping the remaining phases. One way this might occur is if the input data is incorrect or invalid. If data fails validation in either apply request values or process validation phase, the information about the error is saved and processing proceed directly to the render response phase. Also, if at any point in the life cycle the request processing is complete, and non-JSF responses is to be sent to the client, the flow of the execution can exit while lifecycle without completing further phases. Here the phases request is connected to restore view. Restore view is connected to apply request values, and apply request value is connected to process event. Then it can connect it to a response complete, and process event can connect it to render response, and process event is connected to process validations. Process validation is connected to process events. Process event can connect to process response complete, or process event can connect it to process event with validation, can connect to render response with validation errors, and process event is connected to update model values. Update model values connected to process event. Process event can connect to response complete, and process event can to render response with conversion errors. Process event is connected to invoke application. Invoke application is connected to process event. Process event can connect to response complete, or process event can connect to render response. Render response is connected to phase response. Now this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for watching it.